Hey, you wouldn't be interested in learning about my 3D game asset workflow by any chance, would you? Well, good, because I'm making a tutorial about that exact thing right now, and you can watch if you want to. So yeah, this is going to be a start to finish look at my workflow for creating assets for specifically Of Love and Eternity. It's a style that I created specifically for this project to achieve a kind of nostalgic PS1, PS2 era throwback look. If you see the game assets in the actual game, you might get the impression that there's a lot that goes into making the game look that way, but you'll find out through this tutorial that it's actually deceptively simple. It's so simple, in fact, that I felt like kind of silly even making a full-length tutorial to showcase it. But as I thought more about it, there are little tricks here and there that I do use to create the assets. So maybe make your expectations a little bit lower, because there isn't really a whole lot to it. It is really creating an asset, texturing it, putting the engine. But there's the little things that I do here and there that I'll show you how I do that give the game or the game assets anyway, kind of a throwback look to it. I'm not going to say that they could pass as like authentic PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2 visuals, but there's enough there so that when you look at them at a glance, you can get that impression of kind of that crunchy pixelated look. And that's all you really need, is that impression. And then, there's a lot of processing on top of that in the engine that gives those assets that extra special feel, the distinctive style that you might already be familiar with. Like I said, we're going to start from start to finish. So everything starts in a 3D software of your choice. In this case, I'm going to be using this very ancient version of Maya. It's almost a decade old, but don't let that stop you. You don't need Maya. You can use Blender. There's plenty of other free software out there if you're unable to purchase software. I just happen to have bought a perpetual license for this. I don't need to get into that for this tutorial. Yeah, so the groundwork is basically I'm going to be making a very simple asset. We're going to be making a crate, right? So it's just a box. And that's one, me being a little lazy. And that's also two, just to quickly show you the basic process, and you can take that and use it with anything else that you dream of to put in your own game to give it the same kind of look, or use the same technique to get the same effect. So let's just do a crate for now. Just humor me a little bit. Let me make my crate, because obviously it is just a cube. So I'm going to be making a cube here. We're going to go through this whole process, okay? So just bear with me. And I know that my character in game is scaled 3 units tall. So I'm going to make this crate 2 units big. And that's really it. I mean, our crate is done. Simple as that. But what's different, what I kind of like to do with my assets, I think most of my assets have this, is what I call a detail layer. And that's a special layer, an actual physical mesh layer that I can add a different texture to give the model a little more depth. So for this example, I'm going to go into like a ghost mode here just so you can see. I'm simply going to duplicate this mesh and scale it up a little bit. And what that'll be used for is to put the detail on. Honestly, it could be anything. It could be grime, it could be grunge, it could be mold, stuff like that. In this case, it's going to actually be part of the crate itself. So I'm going to scale it up a little bit here. And yeah, so a crate, usually if you imagine a crate in your head, it has the wood planks and stuff, but it also has like these kind of planks on the exterior of the actual retaining walls of the plank, which create like a frame, right? Sometimes there's crossed planks here. There's usually like a frame around it. And I want that to actually pop out a little bit more. And so that's going to be a separate texture that we're going to apply directly to this detail layer here. And the box that's within there, you're going to see straight through that detail texture to the actual underlying planks in there. So it'll give it like kind of a 3D look. At least at a distance, it should look pretty nice. And in my game, I use this detail layer for everything, all the trees or for most things, right? Trees, they have like an extra layer for the bark, so the bark has like a 3D effect to it. The player character is actually made of several different detail layers. So the first layer is a skeleton, the second layer is a body, the third layer is the armor, and the armor itself has its own little layers to it too. And so yeah, that's basically what I use to create that amount of depth and that amount of detail with the assets. So very simple in the case of a cube, right? Because we're already done. I'm just going to merge this together, and we're basically done with that. Now at this point, it's basically up to you if you want to start working on the texture sheet now, so you can UV unwrap with the texture already prepared. But since I already have an idea of what this is going to need for UV unwrapping, I'm just going to do that now. It's going to be pretty simple. The interior cube is going to be on one half of the texture map, and the exterior cube is going to be on the other half. It's going to be a 2x1 texture. Just in the case of this tutorial, I mean, you can do whatever you want with the UVs, really. It's completely up to you. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and try to remember how these tools work. It's going to be different in every software. Oh, I remember. It is actually selecting the faces here. Unitize. There. So what I basically did was I took every polygon here and mapped it to fill the entire UV space here. And that way I can go ahead and put half of it on one half of the UV sheet. And don't worry about the texture being stretched out or anything because these aren't square. Even though the texture space is 1:1, our texture is going to be 1:2, so it'll fix itself. And yeah, we're ready to start our texture. And for this particular style, I opted for using purely photo textures for the simple fact that it's much easier. There's a lot of photo texture resources online. So yeah, let me show you a couple of them actually, just to get you started. If you don't already know any photo texture resources online, there's a lot of them. Just do a search on Google and you're bound to find some. I also recommend looking on forums like Polycount or other developer forums for people who have suggested resources. These are pretty old resources that I'm going to show you, so maybe there's more up-to-date ones, but honestly, it doesn't matter too much. Okay, so I'm going to show you two examples here. This one is currently the kind of industry standard for finding textures. They have a huge library of textures, very well organized, easy to search through. They have scans, they have detailed textures like normal maps and specular. They have PBR materials, they have everything you need. And unfortunately, recently they went premium or subscription based, whatever you want to call it. And you need to have a monthly subscription. But if you can swing that cost, it's well worth it. There's a lot of resources here. It's just a really, really nice library. For most of my career, it was actually free. You had daily credits. You could spend like 15 of them a day. And felt like I was getting away with murder kind of because the higher res textures were more credits and the lower res textures were less credits. So I could just go for the lowest res and get stuff for just 1 credit essentially. A lot of nice looking textures. Like I said, industry standard. There's a high likelihood that you've seen these textures in a game you've played before. I, for one, have spotted a lot of the grunge textures that I've used of love in other games, which is kind of fun to see, like kind of a little Easter egg. I, though, as indie developer, have no money, can no longer swing this cost. Unfortunately, it was a surprise while I was actually starting to record this part of the tutorial, I found out. And so that was a bit of a bummer that I couldn't show you the process using one of their textures. But like I said, there's plenty of other resources, one of them being texturer.com. It's a good, trusted website, all free textures, all taken. I think the creator of the website took these photos themselves, I think. And so they're free to use. Just check out the terms of use anytime you find a website like this. Usually it'll let you know that you can use it for personal and commercial use. This totally works for us if you're making something for your own personal use, maybe a school project or just an experiment, or you're actually building something for a client and you need to sell the thing. You can grab textures here and use them for your commercial purposes. So not as broad as textures.com, but still a humble and serviceable resource for getting all kinds of different textures. A lot of great stuff on here. In our case, we're going to use the wood section here. And I'm just going to search around for a nice looking wood plank, hopefully, texture that we can use. Okay, so I looked through here a little bit, made it to about page 4, and actually found a texture ready with kind of a cross-plank feature here. And it's not perfect. It's got a lot of stuff in the way, and it doesn't have a full square around the outside of the frame there. But we can fix all that stuff in Photoshop. Even the coloring isn't what I would like. It also, I think it's a gate. It's not actually a crate. But for our purposes, for the purpose of this tutorial, this should work fine. Maybe you found something a little nicer, but this is a good mixture of, it has some features that I need already in place and missing a few features that I'll add in Photoshop. So that's a good example. So I'm gonna go ahead and download that. Doctoring the photo to make it a useful texture is a lot of tweaking and a lot of different steps and stuff. It's always very unique to each texture. So I'm gonna try my best to narrate over this and work at the same time. It's something I never do, but hopefully it all makes sense in the end. Hopefully it's not too long. So for this particular texture, what I want to do is kind of crop out what I actually want to use as the texture, because there's a lot of nonsense over here that I don't want. And I also want to remove this element here, any element that is too unique for its own good to be used as a texture, because you want the texture to be not so noisy. It's also not square in the photo. This thing looks a little crooked to me. Maybe these slats are just crooked and the photo's actually fine. But all these sorts of things I want to clean up before I actually turn it into a texture. So before I start, I'm going to just copy this layer so I can work on a fresh layer. I like to work non-destructively, so every step of the way I'll create a new phase. So first of all, let's put some guides in here. I'm just going to line it up. You know, maybe it's just my impression. No, it is crooked. Looking at this guide here, some of them are crooked, some of them aren't crooked. Let's see. Is it really crooked? Ah, okay. So it's not bad. So I won't have to do any warping or anything like that. It looks pretty good. Maybe some of these slats are crooked, but all right, we'll keep it the way it is. I'm still going to crop everything out, everything that I don't need. Crop this out. I'm going to use a bit of this side here for the right side edge, and then move this in here because we don't need that end there. And so this is basically a stretched out version of what our final is going to look like. And I think what I want to do, I guess I'll do the big things first and work small. So let's see if I can remember how to use Photoshop. Spot healing tool. I think I can just like make this go away using their magic stuff. Awful. I don't know. I don't know how it works, but sometimes it works. Yeah, it looks awful. I don't know what it's thinking, but I can at least spot heal this away. I'm gonna see if I can use this slat as the side slat. I'm also gonna copy this. Let's see. Duplicate that and just bring it right over here. This will be our other side here. Hopefully this ends up making sense. I'm not even confident in my narration because I'm trying to focus on all this stuff at once. I'm gonna put a little drop shadow on that, just to make it look more like its counterpart on the right side. Okay, I think I'm gonna stretch that right down to the bottom because I think it should be on top of this one. Now that I have this, I'm just gonna copy this and make this side for this side. Flip it back over. So that's basically the same thing, just stretched down. And no one will ever know or even question it. For this weird part up here, you can do a similar thing. Grab a little element from over here, copy it, and I'm gonna just flip it just so it doesn't look too tiled and just block that right out. And I could even like stretch it because no one will ever notice. That looks okay. I'm gonna erase the side of it to give it a softer look. I'm gonna brush this so it's softer on the edge so no one sees that seam. That's okay like that. So that's pretty much most of it taken care of. Let's see if this magical spot healing tool can take at least this out for us. It's not working. I don't get what's happening here. This Photoshop is all new, so healing brush tool? Is that what I wanted? No? Patch tool. We'll try the patch tool. Grab this whole thing. The patch tool works where you just find a new spot to blend in. That looks okay, right? It looks a little high contrast now. I don't know why I did that. You know, I can do better than that. Let's just grab a piece of board from over here. Slide it over here just to cover it up. And then I'm going to softly, the same as I did to the board above there, is just kind of softly blend it in. A couple other things I see here. We're going to want to change a lot of the colors so it's not so noticeable. I want to get rid of this really shiny thing here. I'm not sure what that is, but we don't want that. I wish this spot healing brush was working. I don't know. It's like making ugly decisions. Looks bad. I don't know why it's looking so bad. I don't trust it. I'm just going to do that same thing again. I'm going to grab a piece from over here. Let's make sure it's tall enough just to hide that little part. And I'm always duplicating and dragging so I have like a layer to work with. Scooch that into place and then use my soft erase to blend it back in. That's pretty nice. Not bad. At a distance and at a small res, you'll never tell. I've actually done this process to the point where I go and I copy nails and put nails in and stuff. But then like you realize at the end of the day, you don't see it. So, because we're going to shrink this right down into I think it's 126 by 250 or 128 by 256 texture. It's going to be really small. So really not a whole lot of reason to do something like that. A couple other really obvious ones are these knots. You want to get rid of like some of these distinctive things. And it seems like this spot healing brush is doing fine with this. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and just merge everything into one layer so I have like a master edited layer here. And I'll make this whole thing square for us, just because the final image is going to be square. So you want to go to image size, take the smallest number and make it square using that value. So you keep as much of the resolution as you can. Hit OK. And now we have a perfectly square texture to work with. And at this point, I kind of want to see what it looks like at a low res, but I'm not going to just shrink the texture right down. I want to maintain this level of fidelity for editing. If I ever need to edit anything, I want to edit at this resolution. I don't want to edit at 128 by 256 resolution, because at that point you're pushing pixels around and it's not as easy. So what I'm going to do is select everything, right click it and convert it to a smart object. And unfortunately, I think this is a Photoshop specific feature. So I'm not sure what sort of workaround there'd be for other photo editing software, but if you do have Photoshop, you can do this. And it might be worth looking up if you have, I don't know, Photo P or, I don't know, GIMP or any of those other free or, alternative photo editing softwares. But I use this to keep this file editable always, even if I shrink it down or mess around with it on a kind of a macro level, like you'll see in a minute. And I can always just click on this, double click, open up this file, and have all my layers available to me. So that's pretty useful and that's how I handle all my textures, just to make sure it's a lossless process, so I never lose the ability to go back and edit a texture. So now I'm going to create a new document, and this time I want it to be the small res, right? So the width is going to be 128, and the height will be 256. So I'll create that, and we'll get this triangle here. And that is so we have space for one half to be the detail texture and the other half to be the normal base background texture that we want. So now that we have this set up and we have our texture compacted into this smart object, I'm just going to copy this over to this smaller texture. And of course, it's going to be like blown out because it's so huge. So we want to scale that right down and fit it within our new texture. And because it's a smart texture, we can just scale it and not worry about anything breaking. I actually also want to find the halfway point here so I know exactly what I'm looking at, and just scale this right down until it is perfectly, doesn't have to be perfect, but until it fits within the bounds of the texture, right? I try to get as close as I can. The smart object saves effects like the drop shadow like I added there. So it's not going to be a perfect lineup. In this case, I could go back and delete that drop shadow, like I could merge it with the layer and delete it. But it's fine if we do it like this too. There's no need to be a perfectionist about this sort of thing. But because we do have this drop shadow, I'm going to select this whole square down here and make this layer, give this layer a mask so it doesn't show up. So now we have this perfect crisp line there. Yeah, it looks pretty good so far. And it's nice to look at it this way because we can get a better idea what it's going to look like in game, right? So a couple things I'm noticing is there's a lot of green on top and that we have this blue bar down here. And I see that becoming, even this crossbar here is blue as well, where it hasn't really gotten as much mold or moss or whatever on it. So that tells me that I want to go back to the texture and touch up a couple of these color details with some color correction before we move on. But it's nice to see it in this format right now. So as we work, we can check in on it and see. And you'll see now how the smart object works. If I make any changes to the smart object, I can actually close this now. Don't save. If I make changes to the smart object, we'll see the changes appear over here as well. And that's just a nice little Photoshop feature. So usually to balance color like this, I'll make a new layer and I'll just grab the color that I want to keep. So this kind of green texture, I'm just going to make it all green so I can uniformly change the color of the texture later. So I'm going to give the bottom part a hue of green. And any part that looks like it's too blue, I'm going to brush out. Kind of like this. Doesn't have to be perfect or anything. Maybe a little bit more there. And now we can just blend this with color. Where's the color? It's down here. Oh, that looks bad. Oh no, there we go. So now I've kind of tinged that green. It looks too green, so I'm going to back it up a little bit here. You can also use the other blending features, like we could probably use multiply as well to pretty good effect, or you can mess around with these and figure out what they do for you. Overlay is a bit strong. Hard light looks pretty good. I'm also using the preview up there. It's called the Navigator in Photoshop. I use that as well just to get a bird's eye view of the texture, because a lot of times when you're working and you're too close to it, you can sort of lose the effect of certain changes. And so it helps to glance up and see it in small scale. I think that looks pretty good though, just doing the color mode there. Crank up the opacity a little bit. to let a little of the color variation through. And you'll see once I save it and we look back here at our texture, we see that blue is gone on this texture because we are using the smart object there. Maybe that's a little too strong. I'm going to back it up a little bit more. I want a little blue in there. Save it again. And that's okay. That looks pretty good to me. Now that things are kind of even, I'm going to start messing with the contrast. A lot of textures, if you have too many brights in them, they can stand out too much. If they have too many deep darks in them, that can stand out if it's kind of uneven. So you want to make this is not a bad texture, honestly, but there's a lot of stuff in here as far as the contrast goes that will stand out too much in the final texture. It's a case by case. So I'm going to go in here, brightness, contrast. I don't know, maybe I could do levels or curves even. Let's just do contrast. That's just quick and easy. I could just bring this slider down and make the contrast low. And by doing that, you kind of pull a lot of the attention away from the highlights and stuff, which can make your game kind of look oversaturated, or, you know, it can have negative effects on the overall. So maybe just a slight adjustment there. There is also this shadow here on the top that I want to emulate on the bottom too. So let's do that. That's actually something pretty simple. So I'm going to make another layer. Because this is straight, I'm just going to make a selection here like this. If it was crooked, I'd use the pen tool to make that selection. So I can actually show you how to... No, this isn't a Photoshop tutorial. I'll just show you how to do the basics. I'm going to invert the selection, bring up a brush. I'm going to create a nice shadow here. Let's see if I can do this properly. Nice soft brush with the color black here. And I'm just going to make a shadow myself here. And then I'll go and clean it up because I made a mess. So yeah, now we have a nice shadow there. I'm going to blend it with multiply, I think is the smartest way to do shadows. And make it like, actually, you know, it might match better if I use overlay. Make it a little bit bigger here. Just make it stretch a little further. Move it back down just to match that shadow that's up there. Just to make it look like it matches a little bit more. What is this? There's actually a layer I have left on here. I can't remember what that was, but turning it off helps. I don't know what that layer is. I didn't name it. That's why I don't know. I'm just going to delete it. So now we have our shadows back from these edge pieces here. Couldn't tell you what that was all about. Save that and just see what it looks like in our low res. So we do all that work and then we come down and here it is like tiny little resolution. But I can't tell that my shadow is a little too bold there. So I'm going to make it lower opacity. That's better. It looks a little more natural. I wish I could make the contrast less. Even less. It's not really going as far as I want it. So you know what I'm going to do? I'll hide that and I'll do this with curves by hand instead. Working with curves is a little funny, but once you learn it, it's pretty helpful. So let's see if this... Yeah, okay, so I basically put a key here on this curve, and this is the dark area, this is the light area up here. So this is how I can tweak the lights and the darks a little easier. I can even bring this in a little further to grab less of the darks. But now when I bring this up, I'm gonna be pushing those darks out of the image. You can sort of see, you know, I'm basically inverting them at this point. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit just to make the contrast a little lower. Maybe bring this back to where it was. And then I'm going to bring this one down to make the lights a little darker as well. As you can see, those highlights disappear. And that really helps you get rid of distracting elements or high contrast elements in your texture. And you can fiddle with these very fine adjustments, really. But that'll help your texture be more versatile in the engine once it's got less distractions in it. This is a pretty busy texture, but at the resolution we're working, it's not so bad. If I combine that with my contrast layer, I think that works okay. I'm going to save that. Come back here, and now we see, it's a pretty decent texture there. It's working. I think the last thing I'm going to do, just for the sake of the tutorial, just to keep things speedy, because I could work on this for a lot longer, tweaking things, I'm just going to take the saturation down, just so the green isn't so green, because it might pop a lot in engine, depending on the effects that I have. So I'm going to bring this down. I don't want to make it gray, because then it gets boring. I want to leave a little bit of that green in there, just a hint. So around there is fine. Save that. And here we have our final base texture. I think it looks pretty good. And now for the detail layer, this is a matter of just copying what we've already done and isolating the elements we want to be details. For the crate in particular, it's going to be these border edges and this like little cross beam here. And those will be my detail elements. So I want to create a new... No, you know what? I'm just going to copy this. I'm just going to duplicate this. And if you're in Photoshop, this is Photoshop specific, you can copy your smart object normally and do whatever you like with it in this scene itself here. Like you can transform it and stuff. But any edits you do within the smart object, like if you go in again like this and do some tweaks and save it, it'll reflect it in both of these separate layers. And the only way to avoid that would be to right click it and new smart object via copy, this option here. If you click that, it'll copy your layer and it'll also make a new smart object with all that same content. So if you edit that, they'll stay separate from each other. This isn't really a Photoshop tutorial, so I'm not going to really go all in on that. But just say, for example, if you wanted them to be separately edited afterwards, you can use this option and maybe experiment with that. But for the sake of this tutorial, I want my changes to be on both of these at the same time. So if I do change the coloring in any of these, it'll be reflected on both halves of this texture. So now that we have this copied, we can go in and isolate the elements that we want to use for our detail. And so I'm just going to grab the pen tool and make some selections here. And now I'll make that my selection and fill this in with the paint bucket tool on the mask. So we now have this frame of the crate isolated in the texture, and it has transparency and everything. So we can see that by turning off the background layer. The last thing I want to do now is add the dither layer. And the dither layer is something I came up with to sort of simulate the dithering that you'd see on textures from the PS1, PS2 era. And because the actual dithering process involves reducing the amount of colors you can include in your textures. So example, we have 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit colors. I didn't want to remove all the colors from my game. So instead of being wholly authentic to those older classic games and losing a lot of color, gaining a lot of style, of course, but losing a lot of color, I ended up with this trick to add a dithering layer on top and overlay that so that it kind of has the same effect, like the same visual effect, without losing that color. So I'll show you how that's done. In Photoshop, at least, you first need to create a pattern, because I'm going to be using the paint bucket tool and using the pattern option here. And I don't have the pattern made just yet because it's a new install of Photoshop. So I'm going to show you how to make that. And it's really as simple as making a new document. And it just has to be 2 by 2 because we're just going to make a checker pattern. So I have this tiny little document here. We'll zoom way in. And on a new layer, I'm going to select the pencil tool and add just 2 blocks of black here. And so if this were tiled, it would create an infinite checker texture. And we'll want to hide our background layer, go up to Edit and down to Define Pattern. And we can make this a new pattern of ours. So I'll call it checker. That's fine. And we hit OK. And now we should be able to select our thing from up here. There it is. Go into our texture document, make a new layer. I'm actually going to name this one dither. And with our paint bucket tool selected, we can just fill the whole layer with our checker texture. And you can see it tiles perfectly across the whole texture and makes it look awful. So what we have to do from here is make sure that the checker isn't appearing on any of the transparent elements. And to do that in this case, I'm just going to group both of these layers here so that they're essentially one object. And if you select the dither layer and hold the Alt key, you can come between the dither layer and this group here and click, and that will apply the dither layer to only what's visible in the group below it. So as you can see, the transparent areas don't have the dither anymore, and the apparent areas, the opaque areas, have dither. However, I do see a little issue here where there's on the seams of the layer where there's like semi-transparent pixels. So to fix that, it just needs like some pixel information below it. So I'm just going to add a new layer, grab my brush tool, and just add a line on those seams underneath. You shouldn't see them. Let's see. I mean, okay, so maybe I should add a white line instead. Let me just invert the color. Okay, so it's not that big a difference. It's just making those semi-transparent pixels opaque. And that seam appears because our smart object is scaling down and smoothing in a way that leaves some semi-transparent pixels. That's just the way Photoshop works. And that's how you can fix that. So in the same group, I added a little line between each of those just as a background so the dither can grab that 100%. And now I'll grab my dither layer and I'm going to set it to, I usually use overlay for this so that it kind of treats the highlights and the shadows in a more interesting way, in a more vivid way. So, and the trick here is like, don't leave it really strong. Just give it the effect of dithering and nothing more. Like you don't want it up here. That's distracting. That's going to make your game look like a picnic table. So I usually bring it like way down and then I start creeping it up slowly until the effect is there and I'm getting like a nice level there. Like up here, it really ends up looking like it's been dithered, but you can't necessarily see a checker pattern in there because you don't want to see that. You just want to see the dithering. And it's different from texture to texture. So you want to play with it until you find a little happy balance there. So I think that looks pretty good. It's looking nice and crispy, and it's ready to be applied to the 3D object. So we'll jump back into our 3D software and put that on to see what it looks like. Okay, so back in Maya, I'm going to turn off this ghosting effect here. I'm going to select the material and put the texture there. All right, and switch on textures and see how we managed. Okay, already looking pretty nice. You have you can kind of see the 3D effect there. Maybe it's not so strong. I don't know if every 3D software has this effect, but I'm going to turn off the filtering type. We're also going to do this in Unity or in Engine on the final material, and that's going to give us the pixelated, crisp look. So this is just to give me a clearer idea of what it looks like. Yeah, so from here, just do a little touch-ups with the UVs. It looks like everything kind of tiled properly when I set my UVs originally. But I'm seeing now that the box inside is the same size as the box outside the texture is, so we need to change that. So I'm going to grab the UVs for the interior box and just kind of lock them within the bounds of that interior element in there. So we're not going to see those borders or anything on the outside. So now it looks a little nicer. It makes a little bit more sense. But I think maybe the box on the outside is still too big. So another easy fix. I'm just going to push it back in a little bit. Let's see, that was much too far. It's just for the hint of the effect of the 3D. And you'll see in Unity, I actually have screen space ambient occlusion enabled, and that actually, in the transparency, that kind of grabs the detail layer and puts shadows on the box underneath it. So we get some really nice contrast against the detail layer on the flat underlying box. So a little more adjustments here. I'm still going to pull it out just a little bit more, because it is cool. You kind of get like a shadow on the top there, which gives it a little 3D effect there. And you're always going to get this kind of like duplicated bar here in the middle, which I think is fine because it kind of describes an edge or something if you're at this distance. You can kind of get a good effect of it if I moved around from here. But if you don't like that and you want to remove that and just rely completely on the detail layer for that sort of thing, you can, of course, just jump into Photoshop and remove that bar from the non-detail layer element there, that part of the texture. So yeah, to me, that seems like everything worked out fine with the textures. So now I'm going to export this and bring it into Unity, and we can see what it looks like inside the actual engine. So now that everything's imported, this next part's sort of specific to Unity, but I feel like you should be able to find parallels in the engine that you're working with. So I'm going to just go through the import process here real quick, because some of it is important to the way the asset looks as the final product. So firstly, I'll grab the cube object, that's our crate, and because I imported from Maya, I need to uncheck this box and apply that just to make sure the scale all works out, because I think if you do it by default, it's going to be really tiny, because something about Maya uses centimeters for units and Unity uses meters for units, I think, something like that. So it'll be quite a few times smaller, 100 times smaller than it should be. So make sure you grab that. There's no rig, there's no animation, so just clean everything up here, make sure everything's imported properly. So that looks good. I'm just going to take this mesh and drag it right into the scene so we can see what we're working on here. And then nextly is the texture itself. This is more important to the final look, so hopefully you can find similar features in your own engine. But the first thing is just to make sure that the texture is importing with alpha transparency. So you have to check that box there in Unity. Apply that and you'll see we now have our transparency back. It's using the PNG transparency rather than using a masked layer or something like that. And the next part, this is a little more important, is to change the filter mode to point, so it's not going to use any filter. Just like I did in Maya there, by changing the filter mode to be off, that's the same thing here, so we'll apply that as well. And it'll make the texture look all crispy and you can see all the pixels and stuff whenever we apply it to the model, to the material and everything. So speaking of which, I'm going to come down here and actually just create a new material. We'll just call it tutorial crate material. And I actually have my own shader that I use for the game, and it is called of diff double-sided. And that's a double-sided material. That way the detail layer, we can see both sides of it. Maybe you don't need double-sided, but I think you'll have some problems with seeing through the detail layer on some angles and it'll look a little funny. So I think that's what we want. So I'm going to put that on the model, come in here and select our tutorial crate texture, and there it is in the engine. So that's it in Unity. It doesn't look too dissimilar from it in Maya. So now from this point, it's a pretty standard looking asset still. Like you don't get a whole lot of depth to the material. And that's because another big thing I use in my game that helps a lot to describe these detail textures, these detail layers, is that ambient occlusion post-processing effect that I was talking about. So to see that, this is a default scene. I'm just going to delete the basic camera. Actually, we can take a peek and see. Okay, so that's what it looks like with lighting and stuff. Give it a little rotation so you can have a look-see. So yeah, right away you can see it looks a little nicer with some shadows and stuff getting involved there. So that's pretty cool. It looks a little more high fidelity than just two cubes, right? Like you actually have a nice little layer of detail there. So that's cool to see. And so I'm gonna actually delete this main camera and bring in my prefab of my main camera, which I use for the game. And this has a bunch of features already applied to it. It has the Unity post-processing stack, and that includes a bunch of interesting shaders. I guess I can run through that. Wait, actually, let me get a better view first. We're inside the cube right now. So I'll back the camera right up, and now we can see more what it looks like through the lens of the game. So we're going to have this nice filter over everything, and we have all the post-processing happening. It's starting to take on more of a retro aesthetic because of the camera settings. So we'll run through those now. Let me get a nice little angle here so we can appreciate it. Okay, so in the camera, like I said, there's the post-processing stack right here, the post-processing behavior, and that is using all these interesting things that really make the game look the way it does. So first thing, like I mentioned, ambient occlusion is checked here. If I turn it on and off, you should see, I guess it's not super high detailed at this distance, but you do see how it kind of shades in those corners, the edges that are around and underneath the detail layer as I turn it on and off. And I don't really want to mess with this right now. Let me just copy and paste this. I'm just going to copy it so I don't ruin it because this is what I actually use for the game. I don't want to mess it up. I can make it stronger so the effect is more visible. So I can make it tighter as well. Okay, so that looks a little nicer. So that's a little easier to tell what's happening there. And that's something I adjusted specifically for my game to look the way it does. And that's something you can mess around with yourself and find a nice balance for your game. But yeah, with the detail layers, it plays a part, and the ambient occlusion, I think, really adds a lot of nice depth and detail to the game. Eye adaptation, that's like HDR stuff. I think it's important. Like it makes the exposure of the game not go too crazy in one way or the other. It keeps it kind of looking cinematic. But the main thing I think that gives the game its look, aside from this dither shader itself and the ambient occlusion, is the color grading. Quite a big difference, kind of night and day with the color grading. This is a color grading scheme that I just tweaked myself. I think one of the bigger features of it is taking this really, really dark and really, really bright contrast and making sure that it's finding a better balance, a more cinematic look to it. And also, like, I love colors, so it's making it much more vibrant. I mean, this is just a wooden crate, so it's not showing off all the colors that you could see, but it is obviously looks more vibrant. It's popping a lot more than the default camera. So color grading, eye adaptation, ambient occlusion, that's really all there is to it. Other things that are on the camera, the dither shader, you can see what that looks like on and off. So that's dither off, dither on. I think that's a great shader. I love that thing. And I think a lot of people really take to the style because of that, the really bold effect that the dither gives the game. Kind of just did a search for a dither shader on the marketplace, the Unity marketplace, and found one that I liked based off of Silent Hill 1 having that dither look to it, and older PlayStation 1 games having that dithered look to it. I don't think you'll find any game that looks quite as crazy dithered, where dithering is everywhere like this. It's very unique to this game. It doesn't look authentic, in my opinion, but I think it gives it a nice charm. And it also adds, if you zoom in here, it adds these jaggies that you want to see that make the game look extra crispy. It basically takes the resolution and halves it or something like that. I didn't make it. I couldn't really tell you how it's done, but I like the effect. There it is. The next thing that I really love as well, that hopefully you can see if I turn it off now and then back on, is this contrast enhanced script. It's an ancient script from an old version of Unity that basically gives edges high contrast. And I think if I zoom in again, you can kind of see what it does. Let's see if we can find a good spot. Maybe if I turn the dither off. Maybe it'll come out across in the video, but this edge here, we have a light section here and a dark section here where the object starts. The contrast enhance is taking that edge and adding a bright line where the light is to define itself better against the dark pixels of the object, which themselves are given this like really dark line. So it's really enhancing the contrast, Let me turn it on and off again. Between the two objects. And really, since it's a screen filter, it's doing it across all the pixels in the screen. So you get contrast enhancements on the texture itself, on everything in the scene. But it really takes everything, makes it a whole lot crisper. It's a classic sharpen filter. They call it contrast enhanced, but it's a sharpen filter. And that's one of the things that I think really makes the game pop as well, especially when you turn off the ordered dither. Even when it's on, I think it plays a pretty big part there. By making it not look foggy, you really get a much better sense of the pixels because it's making those colors a lot more contrasty, as you can see. That's, I think, really all there is to say about that. That's from concept to creation, a cool retro-inspired crate that fits some retro budgets and texture size and definitely fits that aesthetic, at least in spirit, right? It's definitely a process that is rewarding when you see it in engine. I use a lot of older tools such as Maya, and you don't really get to see the fruits of your labor until you get it into Unity and get the post-processing working. Like you saw before, with it all turned off, it kind of looks pretty basic. Not a whole lot going on. But when you start layering on all those different features and tweaking it until you get the look that you want, that reward of finally getting the asset in engine just becomes all the greater, because you get to see something transformed really into something that was kind of usual, into something that really pops visually and stylistically. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you had some nice takeaways from some of the stuff I shared. And yeah, I hope it can help you in the future. So thanks a lot for watching, and take care. Bye-bye.